Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moppin again coming at you with another APUSH video. This is our second video focusing in on topic 7.3, the Spanish-American War and other aspects of foreign policy during the age of imperialism. Last time we were talking about the causes for the Spanish-American War and some of the challenges that the U.S. Military is going to be facing getting involved in that war. Now note, when we talk about the American war effort against Spain, it's not going to be just taking place in Cuba. We're also going to be seeing it in the Pacific. Now, you may recall previously that I mentioned while he was serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and before he was leading the Rough Riders, Theodore Roosevelt will be sending American warships to the Philippine Islands. And guess what? As soon as they get there, the war has started. So we're going to see American military personnel be able to get the jump on the Spanish, and we're going to be seeing that Commodore Perry here is going Commodore Dewey is going to be able to have a tremendous amount of success. So understand that American military success is not going to be just in Cuba, but also out in the Philippines. And in case you weren't aware of this, the Philippines were a Spanish colony at that time period and had been for about 250 years. Now, with the end of the war, the question becomes, what's going to be the terms of the agreement to end this conflict? We know that the United States is pretty much going to wipe the floor with Spain in this conflict. So, what happens? What's going to be going on? Well, remember, this mostly starts based on what was going on in Cuba. The Cubans had been, wanting to gain independence, and now they're going to be able to gain independence from this war. So one of the things that's going to be in the Treaty of Paris ending this war is that Cuba will be independent of Spain. Now, of course, how we're going to define Cuban independence, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But at least for now on the surface, Cuba has now gained independence. However, there's going to be additional territories that Spain will be losing besides Cuba. And these territories are not going to be given the promise of independence. That's going to be including Puerto Rico in the Caribbean and Guam and the Philippines out in the Pacific. So understand now that we're talking about a situation of, where does America go from here? What is the future of the United States in terms of what this means? So, let me kind of take you back here just a moment to a previous slide. The question then becomes, what are we to become? Are we going to be a nation that will liberate its newly acquired territories? Or are we going to become this imperial power that will subjugate natives for American power, glory, and profit? Well, it's going to unfortunately be the latter. We're going to see America's, sphere of influence show American military might in both the Caribbean and the Pacific at the expense of the native peoples in these areas. The most concerning of which is what's going to be happening in the Philippines. Now, when we talk about, the Philippines, the Filipino people had been wanting independence from Spain for a long time, similar to the Cubans. And the native Filipino that's going to be leading the attack against the Spanish and serving as our ally in the war will be Emilio Aguinaldo, as you can see pictured there. Now, note, unlike the Cubans, where we actually had promised them explicitly independence after the war through what's known as the Teller Amendment, and we'll get to that in a moment. But in the Philippines, we never made that express promise. But think about it. If you are Aguinaldo, if you are the Philippines, and we have entered this conflict in the name of, securing Cuban freedom, well, why not the Philippines? But as I said previously, unfortunately for Aguinaldo and the Filipino people, that is not going to be happening. The United States has no interest in allowing the Philippines to be free and have desire to formally annex them. Well, this then is going to lead to what had been our allies in the war now becoming our enemies. And this is going to lead to arguably one of the most tragic conflicts in American history, and one that is going to get very little attention. Very little attention in the media at the time, and unfortunately too little attention in our history books. This is going to be the Filipino Uprising that is going to be which is going to be lasting for about 2 years. When it becomes apparent that the United States will not allow the Philippines to become independent, those same folks that had been allied with us are now going to be attacking U.S. military personnel, trying to drive us out. But the United States military is not going to be having that. And unfortunately, the United States is going to be more than willing to use similar brutal tactics to suppress the Filipino independence movement to what we saw with the Spanish with regards to trying to crush the Cuban independence movement. What I mean by that is that the United States will be using concentration camps. Now note, I'm not talking about, ovens at Auschwitz, but I am talking about the creation of camps where people are going to be fenced in. They're not going to be allowed to leave. They're going to be in cramped quarters, limited access to food and medicine, places where disease will run rampant, a traditional concentration camp. That's the United States. And in the process of suppressing the uprising, we're going to see over 5,000 native Filipinos die in what is ultimately going to be a failed independence movement at that time. So, in order to secure our new possessions, there's going to be a lot of blood that's going to be shed to secure America's new identity as a global imperialist power. And as you can imagine, it is not going to establish a very positive relationship with the Filipino people moving forward. Now, what's going to happen in the Philippines is going to be part of what many anti-imperialists are going to be arguing. And we will see the creation of the Anti-Imperialist League at this time as an attempt to try to politically lobby to end America's imperialist policies of acquiring territories through war or trying to, destroy native governments from the inside, kind of like what we saw in Hawaii. And the Anti-Imperialist League will have some famous, well-known supporters, from Mark Twain to Andrew Carnegie to presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan. But note, the Anti-Imperialist League is going to be representing really a minority of Americans, not the majority of Americans. Unfortunately, most Americans did not seem to have any qualms with what we are doing with regards to the independence and lack of self-determination for native peoples that we are now controlling. Now, what then is the next question is, let's say, for example, that you are Puerto Rico, and you have now been taken over by the United States. The American flag now flies in San Juan. Does that then mean that you now become American citizens and therefore enjoy all the rights that are guaranteed as a part of American citizenship? Well, the insular cases at the beginning of the 20th century are going to say not so fast. The Supreme Court is going to be ruling that being occupied by the United States government does not necessarily convey citizenship. So if you are people from Guam or the Philippines or Puerto Rico, you might be owned by the United States, but you are not legally American citizens. So what does that make you then? Basically captives of the United States government. You are captured territories, and therefore people that have been, in essence, captured. You may not necessarily be in a prison or a concentration camp, but you are not going to be able to secure the benefits of American governing, but you will be suffering the downsides of it. Now note, it's not going to be just territories that we fully annex like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines that are going to be having some challenges following the Spanish-American rule. Another place will be Cuba itself. Now, prior to American intervention in the war, the United States will be passing what's going to be known as the Teller Amendment. Now, the Teller Amendment had made an explicit promise to guarantee Cuban independence if the United States would enter into war with Spain, which we did. And following the end of the war, we signed in the Treaty of Paris an agreement that will create an independent Cuba. So that's not a lie. Cuba does become an independent country as a result of the Spanish-American War. But what that independence is going to look like is not exactly what the Cuban people or what the new Cuban independent government will really have bargained for. Why? Because shortly after the war ends in 1901, Congress will pass an addendum to the Teller Amendment known as the Platt Amendment. And what this does is going to basically turn Cuba into a protectorate of the United States. What is a protectorate? A protectorate is a nation that is independent on the surface, but is clearly heavily influenced and dominated by a neighboring, stronger government, which is in this case going to be the United States. So let's take a look at what we mean as, part of the terms of the Platt Amendment that's going to showcase Cuba becoming a protectorate. So, Cuba is going to be independent, but if the Cuban government wants to sign any treaties with foreign countries like, say, Mexico or Colombia, they've got to get American approval. Cuba's going to be independent, but the United States is going to have the right to intervene militarily regarding domestic issues in Cuba. What does that mean? Well, if you read between the lines, it basically means this, that if we do not like the Cuban government, we have the right to military intervene, overthrow it, and install a government that we like. Cuba's going to be independent, but the United States is going to have the right to be able to lease land or buy land to set up military bases, which we do. Case in point, the creation of Guantanamo Bay Marine Base, which we still own and operate today. And some of you may have wondered previously, like, how do we have a Marine base in Cuba when the Cuban government is communist and they hate us? Well, this is why. We will own this base well before communism takes over Cuba. So when we wrap this up, yes, on paper, Cuba is still independent, but in many respects, they're not really. They basically are going to have this parental, almost Britney Spears style conservatorship instituted by the United States. So where Cuba really can only have a government that the U.S. likes. It can only make treaties with countries that get the approval of the United States, and we can set up a military base there anytime we want. So they're really going to be treated as a child of the United States rather than an independent country. Now, as a result of this war, some other things that we should make mention of. Going into 1900, William McKinley, looking to earn a second term, is going to be capitalizing on the success of the Spanish-American War, and in particular, the growing celebrity of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is going to take his fame and celebrity from the Rough Riders, because following the Rough Riders, he basically becomes a household name. He will then parlay that into quickly becoming the next governor of New York, where he gains an even better reputation. He's seen as this progressive reformer and an amazing leader, and Republican leaders are scared to death of Roosevelt. Roosevelt is a progressive at a time where most Republicans are not progressives, and there's a fear that this guy Roosevelt is going to make things a lot more complicated for the traditional party bosses. So what they decide to do, put him in the one position that looks like a promotion but actually strips him of any real power. That is becoming vice president. So Roosevelt's put on the ticket with McKinley, and McKinley will win that second term, once again defeating William Jennings Bryan. So understand that this is going to put Roosevelt on the trajectory to becoming president of the United States in the future. Also keep in mind, many of the divisions of the Civil War, North versus South, will be healed in the Spanish-American War. You've got a common enemy. You've got Northerners and Southerners fighting together for the first time in a long time. So that's going to help to promote unification. In fact, most Southern states had stopped celebrating July 4th after the Civil War ended. That actually changes after the Spanish-American War. We start to see that being celebrated again. And then lastly, here's obviously the most important thing. Defeating Spain in this conflict is going to assert America is now a top dog varsity level country. We have taken down what had been a traditional long-time global power. We've kind of relegated them to JV status, and we've taken their place. We are now being welcomed at the elite table, the adult table. We are now clearly a global power on the same level as Britain, France, Germany, etc. All right, we'll leave it there. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.